Good morning, everyone. During these lockdown periods, Beyond Law CLC and UILS Punjab University Chandigarh have been holding webinars continuously, and it gives us an immense pleasure that they have been well received, not only during the participation, but as well as on the social media, that is on the Facebook as well as the YouTube. The one interesting facet of today's session is that amongst us we have Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta, former judge of the Supreme Court of India. The facet which is common is that during this lockdown period, we tried to unlock ourselves in a different ways and different manners so that we could learn different things and invent ourselves. And interestingly, Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta is the first judge of the Honorable Supreme Court who was given farewell on a virtual platform. So the first credit goes to him. It is just like when we remember Tenzing and all, as well as whosoever has done good achievements. Down in the history, it would be always remembered that Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta got the first farewell on the Zoom application itself. And another feature was that we, while sitting in Chandigarh or Pan India, we got an opportunity to see that virtual farewell, which was a new thing for large number of students, lawyers, etc., which in the ordinary course we would not have done. Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta has been a judge in the Himachal High Court, Chhattisgarh and Tripura. He has a vast knowledge. He has penned down various judgments which are treated as an assets for the legal luminary part as well as for other future judgments, reference, etc. Amongst us, we have Professor Ratan Singh, who is the director of UILS Punjab University Chandigarh, which is a 5 years integrated course for the purposes of one who wants to do law. Professor Ratan Singh, I've been just told. So, Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta, it gives us immense pleasure that the topic, once we are talking of ADR, that is alternate dispute redressal, and arbitration is one of the feature which every student of law, otherwise other professionals, want to learn the nitty-gritties of arbitration. And when it comes to arbitration, we thought there could be no one better who could explain the subtle differences between section 34 and 37 and what is the role of the courts. Because invariably we are reading the part that courts should not ordinarily tinker with, but there are section 34 and 37, what is the scope, etc. In this platform, we would be guided through with his vast knowledge as to what is the scope, etc. Over to you, Honorable Mr. Justice Deepak Gupta. I again welcome you all. I welcome you to this platform.
Thank you so much, Vikas, and thank you to the Beyond Law SCLC and ULSP of Punjab University for organizing web seminars. In fact, there have been a suite of web seminars, and now one seminar is overlapping the other. And there have been a few seminars on the subject which we're talking about. So there is a bit of overlap. It is a privilege for me to join you here today. And I see a few familiar faces. I see from Simla, Mr. Bhogal, who's an arbitration expert. I see Ramakant Sharma. And I mean, from the few faces I can see, I see Dipali Puri in Chandigarh. So people I know, so it's good to have people you know sitting there and listening to you and discussing the issues with you. You said that I was the first judge to get a virtual farewell. Well, that is a first which I think nobody will ever be able to change, because that's the first virtual farewell. And that advantage of the first virtual farewell was that I could address not only the members of the Supreme Court Bar Association, but people with whom I practiced in Simla and people who I had heard in Tripura and Chhattisgarh. So it is always, these new experiences. And I think in the coming times, this is going to be the new normal. I had said about 5 years back that I envisage a court where the judge is sitting in his chamber, the lawyer in his own chamber, the party watching through at their own house, and proceedings going on. Even today, one can watch the proceedings of the UK Supreme Court live anytime. So we have to progress, and I think this is also one way of progression. Lawyers, judges, all members of the legal fraternity have to get used to these new systems of communication, which can be used very well to settle disputes. Arbitrators and counsel appearing in arbitration proceedings will also have to get used to it. And I think arbitration proceedings, especially in international arbitrations, video conferencing was already being used for quite a bit. And now this will give an impetus to that even more. Coming to the topic, role of courts in arbitration, and especially in section 34 and 30, scope of section 34 and 37. It has been my view throughout that the role of courts should be minimal. Courts should not interfere in arbitrations as far as possible. Courts should resist the temptation of trying to correct every error. See, what happens is that we've been trained, all of us, we've been trained not as lawyers in arbitration, but we've been trained normally in civil law. Then we move towards arbitration. And then what happens is that the CPC gets ingrained in us, and we look at this at every angle as if everything can be objected to and everything can be challenged in a higher forum. And both judges as well as lawyers sometimes tend to overstep while exercising the jurisdiction or invoking the jurisdictions under section 34 and 37. Now coming to the section itself. Section 34 is objections. It is not appeal. First of all, we must realize that the scope of objections, an application for setting aside an arbitration award, is not in the nature of an appeal. It's an application which is more in the nature of an objection. And then the section 34(2), the opening part reads, an arbitral award may be set aside by the court only if. We must emphasize on the word only. Only if certain, and I'll come to 2A as amended now later on, but only if certain conditions are fulfilled. It's not that in every case you can come into. Now the next is the party making the application establishes on the basis of the record of the arbitral tribunal. This has been now amended, and earlier it was different. So now, instead of furnishing proof, the words have been changed to establishing on the basis of the record of the arbitral tribunal. This clearly indicates that you cannot add to anything. You cannot add a document also in proceedings under section 34. Your challenge must be limited to the documents and evidence which are before the arbitral tribunal. You can't say this was left out and this we have to. Because this is by a statutory amendment, by legislation has done this, that establishes on the basis of the record of the arbitral tribunal. A party was under some incapacity. There's no problem with that. Normally there are hardly any litigation on that. A minor, a person unsound mind, insolvent. We know under Contract Act those who can't enter into a contract or are in an incapacity. Then the Arbitration Act is not valid under the law to which the parties are subject. This also doesn't raise many problems. It may raise problems sometimes whether it is illegal under law or not. But if it is understood that it is illegal under any law, and to give an example, a gaming contract to set up a casino in that part of a country which does not, where setting up a casino is illegal, that agreement would be illegal and the arbitration clause would also go. Then the party making the application was not given proper notice of the appointment of an arbitrator. That is the rules of natural justice. If that is not followed, that would also be against the fundamental policy of India. And that is you have to give, obviously there cannot be an award without giving notice to the party. The other portion is, which could be a little tricky, or was otherwise unable to present his case. The party say that I just couldn't present my case to the arbitrator because of A, B, and C reason. And I don't think so. We will apply the principles of the CPC of Order 16, 17, 18, that yes, adjournment was required and this was not done. I don't think that is the scope of that is the scope under 34. 34 would be more in the nature of, like, we've had this COVID pandemic, and it would be that due to this COVID pandemic and the lockdown being established, being put in place by the government, I couldn't come or my witness couldn't come. That may fall under the exception of otherwise being unable to present his case. Otherwise, just being saying that adjournment was not granted or my witness did not come, I don't think that will fall under the purview of 34. Then a dispute not contemplated, I don't want to take too much time on that, because I think there are a lot of judgments on this, that the arbitrators can only decide something which can be referred to them under the arbitration agreement, under the arbitration clause. Sometimes agreements have different portions. Some portion of the agreement is arbitrable and some portion is not arbitrable. So if it is not arbitrable, then obviously the arbitral tribunal has no jurisdiction. But under section 34, then the court must, if it can, divide the award into two, set aside that portion of the award which is not arbitrable, and uphold the other portion of the award. There's no idea of setting aside the award. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, you see what is legal, what the arbitral tribunal could do, and then decide on that, and you don't interfere in that. Now, we come to the next portions. The composition of the arbitral tribunal, I think they're very important. Some courts, I find, tend to, under exercising powers under 11, just don't look at the arbitration clause and tend to appoint either a retired judge or somebody as an arbitral tribunal without seeing what are the elements or what is the composition of the arbitral tribunal which has been laid down in the tribunal, which has been laid down in the agreement. Even the court under 11 can't, unless the parties consent to it, it can't appoint an arbitrator which is not contemplated under the arbitration agreement. Yes, there is an exception. Exception is that if the agreement envisages the appointment of an arbitrator who under the Arbitration Act as now amended cannot be an arbitrator, like say a person who's involved with the company or has financial dealing with one of the parties, then obviously then the court may appoint some other arbitrator. But otherwise the arbitral tribunal must be comprised as per the terms of the agreement. See, as I've already said earlier, it was furnished proof. Now it is established on the basis of record, so I won't repeat on that. And in a judgment delivered on 23rd September 2019, Canara Nidhi versus M. Shashikala, it was clearly said that the legal position is thus clarified that Section 34 application will not ordinarily require anything beyond the record that was before the arbitration. This has been followed in another judgment recently, but again the words used are ordinarily. So the court has left a little leeway that in exceptional circumstances, it may look at some documents which are not part of the record of the arbitral tribunal. I am not very sure, because that again leaves us in a very nebulous state, giving the discretion to the judges deciding the matter, whether they will look into a document or not look into a document. That also opens the field wider. There may be cases where the court feels that a document was excluded by the arbitrator. But then, even if it was excluded, it will form the record of the arbitral tribunal. There's no problem into looking into that document. I mean, if the arbiter says that I will not look into this document because of X reason, and the court finds that it can look into the document, I see no objection in that. But if a new document is placed before the court, I have my little reservations whether that can be looked into by the court. In my view, if the court actually feels that this document is essential to decide and goes to the root of the dispute between the parties, and it should have been placed before the arbitral tribunal, then the proper course would be to remit the matter to the tribunal and ask it to look into the document. But even that should be very, very rarely done. I don't think that should normally be done, because we must now accept the fact that arbitral tribunals must be given some leeway to decide the matters. Then the next clause reads, the subject matter of the dispute is not capable of settlement by arbitration under the clause for the time being in force. So under the law for the time being in force. There are certain disputes which cannot be subject matter of arbitration. Well settled matrimonial disputes, custody battles for children, criminal matters. These can't be matters of subject matter of arbitration, and therefore no doubt that these matters can't be decided by an arbitral tribunal. And if an arbitral tribunal decides these matters, then that portion of the award.
Sorry to bother you. Could you just come closer to the mic, because people are writing on the chat box that it's slightly less audible.
Can you hear me now? I think I
will just ask the people, because I am able to hear it, but some people are writing. Just send your feedback on the chat box, please.
Maybe they need to increase the volume also.
Yeah, it's sometimes. It's fine. It's fine. Those who are having difficulty, they should also check it at their end. Yes, it's fine.
As far back as 2011, the Supreme Court in Booz Allen and Hamilton versus SBI Home Finance gave examples of non-arbitral disputes, such as disputes relating to rights and liabilities which give rise out of criminal offences, matrimonial disputes, guardianship matters, insolvency and binding up matters, testamentary matters, and eviction of tenancy. Though again, eviction of tenancy is now the subject matter, maybe of a larger than the apex court. Now we come to the very more contentious clauses. The first being the arbitral award is in conflict with the public policy of India. And though the explanation added says, for the avoidance of any doubt, it is clarified that an award is in conflict with the public policy of India only if the making of the award was induced or affected by fraud or corruption. There can be no big problem on that. Or was in violation of Section 75 or Section 81. That is where the arbitrator takes into consideration some material placed on record by the parties during conciliation proceedings. Because of the confidentiality of these conciliation proceedings, the arbitrator cannot rely upon anything said or any document or anything which was placed in conciliation proceedings, and therefore that portion may be awarded. Now, is in contravention with the fundamental policy of Indian law, is in conflict with the most basic notions of morality or justice. These are very, very nebulous terms. Any judge can interpret anything to be is in contravention with the fundamental policy of Indian law. And it is in conflict with the most basic notions of morality or justice. I mean, I raise a question, can you say that justice is this? Can justice have only one facet? To every man, justice may mean something else. Even amongst lawyers, even amongst judges, we may all have a different viewpoint on what is justice. Justice does not mean always being strictly in accordance with law. Equity is also justice. social justice, I said though that may not be very relevant in arbitration proceedings, but when I talk of social justice, we have to weigh the scales in benefit of the poor. What is justice is itself a very debatable issue. I mean, you could have to, if you read Amartya Sen's book on justice, you realize that, I mean, you can't really have any fixed notions of what is justice. Similarly, morality. What is moral in one part of the country might be immoral in another part of the country. I belong to a state where there are two tribes where a woman polyandry exists. The first chief minister of our state, Himachal Pradesh, was a barrister and doctorate in law, and his doctorate thesis was polyandry in the Himalayas. For those people, for those women, the men living there, for a woman to have 5 husbands is nothing immoral about it. Rest of the country, we may find it very immoral. So can we place what is moral, what is immoral? These are very nebulous terms. So I don't know why the legislature has left these terms so nebulous that we really can't. I feel, that therefore the courts have to now bring out a situation that there is respect for arbitration. We all talk about arbitration being an alternate dispute resolution mechanism. We all talk about the casework which it will take away from the courts, the burden which it will take away from the courts. But if we are going to reburden the courts by treating Section 34 applications like appeals and deciding every issue on merits, then we have not lowered the burden on the court. We've in fact increased the burden. In my view, some fundamental changes in the thought process of the judges and of the Indian judiciary is required. We must realize that we need to trust our arbitrators. After the amendment of 2015, where now there are conditions laid down, the qualifications laid down for becoming for arbitrators, and arbitrators being appointed either by the parties or by the High Court or the Supreme Court in the case of domestic or international disputes, as the case may be. We must show some element of trust with the arbitrator. See, we will be discussing, I know questions will be asked about the 3-4 new judgments which have come from the Apex Court, where again the court has interfered in or upheld the judgments of the high courts which had interfered and set aside the arbitral awards. Most of these cases, in fact, almost all of them, the arbitral awards are much older than much prior to 2015. And sometimes the arbitral awards on the face of them seem so illegal or bad for various reasons that the court tends to interfere. As far as domestic arbitrations are concerned, and with which we are now mainly concerned, in accordance with the new amendment, I think what's the exact term? Now it can be set aside on the patenting illegality. And patent illegality is such a wide term that patent illegality means something which on the face of it shows illegal. Now that is what the norm should be, that if it is patently illegal, then only set aside. See, the other aspect of the matter is you can set aside an award as a judge. I have experience from the High Court till the Supreme Court. I didn't do many arbitration matters in the Supreme Court, but in the High Court and the Chief Justice, that sometimes you sort at certain awards, and when you have 30 or 40 years experience, reading the award or reading the file, you get a feeling that something is amiss somewhere. That something is maybe corruption, maybe dishonesty, maybe a party, something is really amiss, and you have. But then also, if we are experienced enough as judges, your judgment can be, dictated and framed in such a fashion that it falls within the parameters of what is the scope of interference in Section 34. Hard cases make bad law. And that is what is happening in arbitration too. When courts feel that this award is so illegal, so bad, they feel something is wrong, then they try to go around and set aside the award. But they must try and ensure that done within the parameters, not only under just saying that it's against the fundamental policy of India. That is too wide a term to bring everything. But if you can bring it closer home and say, because of A, B, C, D, E reasons, this award is patently illegal. One of the judgments, I think, in China only, where the reasons, intelligibility of reasons. I think that is a very, very valid ground to set aside a award. Because this act envisages that every award should be a reasoned award, unless the parties have agreed otherwise. Reasons are the heart and soul of any adjudicatory process. In my view, unless the parties agree otherwise, any award must give reasons. Reasons need not be running into 30 pages. Reasons can be in one paragraph also. That is how a good craftsman crafts his award. If you give reasons, they don't have to be lengthy reasons, but you have given reasons, valid reasons, then the courts cannot interfere. Because courts cannot question the reasons. That is not the jurisdiction of the courts to question the reasons. Even if two views are possible, the court cannot interfere. I don't have to take you through judgments. I don't want to waste time doing that. But it is settled law that even if your view is slightly different from that of the arbitrator, you can't. It is only if the arbitrator gives no reasons or his reasons are unintelligent that you can set aside. And I see nothing wrong in that. In the recent past, some judgments of high courts have been set aside on the ground that these judgments are unintelligible and we cannot understand what is said in the judgment. So if the judge or the judge deciding the petition under Section 34 cannot understand what are the judgment and why the arbitral tribunal has come to a final finding, then obviously the arbitral tribunal, the award can be set aside. It is also very clear that the arbitral tribunal cannot touch upon the merits of the case. It cannot go into the factual aspect of the case that to come to the conclusion that the finding is perverse or patently illegal or that it is in conflict with morality or justice. Facts is not the facts. He can't do a reassessment of the evidence to come to that conclusion. It is when ex facie, not only prima facie, it is ex facie on a bare reading of the award itself. It is shown that either there are no reasons or this is a decision which no reasonable man could have reached. And that I always ask the question, where do we find that reasonable man? Who is a reasonable man? Everybody thinks I alone am the reasonable man and anybody else is not reasonable. That is not the way to look at it. It is, if this is a possible view, then you will uphold the award of the arbitrator. See, this brings us back to Renu Sagar. I think that laid down the very basic principles, though it was in the field under the old Act of 1940. No, under the Foreign Award Recognition and Enforcement Act of 1961, where the principles, again, were it is violative of fundamental policy of India, the interest of India or justice or morality. That law was laying down the limitations of what these things meant. But in ONGC versus Saw Pipes, this court took a different view and expanded the scope of interference by the courts. That led to a real change in the law, and courts started interfering in and day out in many awards. We found that in SAW pipes, the scope was expanded from 3, that is fundamental policy of Indian law, the interest of India, or justice or morality. And in addition, it is patently illegal. But in that sense, SAW pipes stand reinstated by the amendment now, which makes domestic awards liable to be challenged, liable to be set aside if they are patently illegal. What is patently illegal was aptly described by the Supreme Court in McDermott versus Burns standard, to hold that such patent illegality, however, must go to the root of the matter. The public policy violation indisputably should be so unfair and unreasonable so as to shock the conscience of the court. Where the arbitrator, however, has gone contrary or beyond the expressed law of the contract or granted relief in the matter not in dispute, would come within the purview of Section 34 of the Act. However, we would consider the applicability of the aforementioned principles while noticing the merits of the matter. What would constitute public policy is a matter dependent on the nature of transactions and nature of statute. For the said purpose, the pleadings of the parties and the material brought on record would be relevant to enable the court to judge. Now that widened the scope even further, that you could really look into the evidence and the pleadings of the parties to decide whether it was even violative of public policy. This was followed in Phulchand. In ONGC versus Western Jacob, fundamental policy of Indian law was tried to be defined a little bit. And they defined 3 heads. The first was duty of the tribunal to adopt a judicial approach. I think there can be no quarrel with that. And judicial approach is something which we lawyers and judges will all understand what is the judicial approach. One is that the principle of natural justice must be followed. Parties must be given hearing. Parties must be given time to lead their evidence, etc. That is a judicial approach. Adhering to the principles of natural justice by the tribunal, there can be no quarrel with that. That the decision of the tribunal must not be perverse or so irrational that no reasonable person would have arrived at the same. This was done relying upon the Wensbury principles. And the Wensbury rules were actually in relation to administrative action and judicial review of administrative action. Now the principle of judicial review of administrative action has been brought into arbitration. I have my slight doubts about that, because I think when we challenge administrative action, it is different, because administrative action is taken by authorities, executive authorities, whereby arbitration is decided by arbitrators either appointed by the parties or by the court. So perverse or so irrational, but that by itself is now not in so many terms, but in the context of being patently illegal, is again a matter which is subject matter of policy. JACO expanded the scope of public policy by a large extent and held that the awards of arbitrary tribunals which resulted in miscarriage of justice could be set aside. This again, I think, is something expanding so far that any judge can say this is miscarriage of justice. These are, terminology which judges and lawyers use, and which is terminology is not clearly defined. In Associated Builders, again, ONGC versus Western Jacob was approved. But with regard to perversity and irrationality, in Associated Builders, the court held, and I quote, "The third juristic principle is that a decision which is perverse or so irrational that no reasonable person would have arrived at the same is important and requires some degree of explanation. It is a settled law that where a finding is based on no evidence, one, an arbitrable tribunal takes into account something irrelevant to the decision which it arrives at. 3, ignores vital evidence in arriving at its decision. Now, these are, I think, what associate builders laid down could also be some of the grounds which should be embedded into what is patent illegality. Because there can be no quarrel with this. A finding based on no evidence. In fact, that would be also be an award without reasons in a sense. Then, and what is no evidence? Because we deal with it in many fields, not only in arbitration. This is a term which all of us. An arbitral tribunal takes into account something irrelevant to the decision which it arrives at. I mean, it might sound farcical, but an arbitral tribunal can say, well, this man has been found guilty of offences in 3 other cases, so I think he must have done this in this case also. No, that's not something he could. He has to decide on the basis of evidence. So, and ignores vital evidence in arriving at this decision. That, again, a document which goes to the root of the case, if that is ignored, then I don't think there's any harm if it's limited to the scope. In associated builders, there's another important para where the court held, it must clearly be understood that when a court is applying the public policy test to an arbitral award, it does not act as a court of appeal, and consequently errors of fact cannot be corrected. I want to emphasize on this because I find many high courts now are starting correcting the orders. You know, we have to give finality to certain cases. Like we say, in a civil suit, finding of fact arrived at by the first appellate court are final. And a regular second appeal only lies on a substantial question of law under section 100 of the CPC and not on any other grounds. Now, you can't reassess evidence under section 100. And that should be the approach under section 34 of the arbitrators also. Just one. See, in fact, the 2015 amendment makes it very clear when by amending, they added the words that for avoidance of doubts, the test as to whether there is a contravention with fundamental policy of Indian law shall not entail a review on the merits of the dispute. So a court looking into an application under section 34 cannot go into the review on the merits of the case. He is only limited to those objections which are provided, and even when we come to public policy, etc., those are material irregularities of the nature which I pointed out above. Award being without reasons, I mean vital evidence being overlooked, or evidence being taken into consideration which could not have been taken into consideration. In these matters only the court can interfere, but it cannot interfere to reassess the merits of the evidence. After 2015, there have been a few judgments. SsangYong is one of the most important of the judgments after 2015, and which narrowed down the expanded scope of public policy and fundamental policy. And I'll quote a paragraph from SsangYong, which reads, thus it is clear that public policy of India is now constricted to mean, firstly, that a domestic award is contrary to the fundamental policy of Indian law as understood in para 18 and 17 of associate builders, which I have referred to above, and also known as the Renu Sagar view. Or secondly, that such award is against basic notions of justice or morality as understood in paras 36 to 39 of associated builders. And therefore, Western Gecko was, in a sense, it was in fact specifically overruled insofar as it was inconsistent with associated builders. But it went on to hold in this SsangYong, insofar as domestic awards made in India are concerned, an additional ground is now available under subsection 2A, added by the Amendment Act of 2015 to section 34. Here, there must be patent illegality appearing on the face of the award, which refers to such illegality as goes to the root of the matter, but which does not amount to a mere erroneous application of the law. In short, what is not subsumed within the fundamental policy of India, namely the contravention of statute not linked to public policy or public interest, cannot be brought in by the back door when it comes to setting aside an award on the grounds of patent illegality. This judgment, I think, very clearly lays down that patent illegality is something else than the others. So if something could not be brought into challenge by way of challenge to fundamental policy or justice and morality, then you can't bring it to the back door by saying it is a patent illegality. Now, patent illegality, they said, there has to be from the record of the case and nothing else. Dyna Technologies, you see, again, this is a judgment where the High Court had set aside the award of the arbitral tribunal, and this award, this judgment of the High Court was upheld by the Apex Court. This is a judgment delivered on 18 December 2019, and it clearly, first part of the judgment clearly says that there is no dispute that Section 34 of the Arbitration Act limits a challenge to an award only on the grounds provided therein, as interpreted by the courts, etc. Time is short, I'll not read all of this, I've almost passed my time. But I'll read one more line. Moreover, umpteen awards have category held that the court should not interfere with an award merely because an alternative view on the facts and interpretation of contract. No doubt, in Dyna, the Supreme Court upheld the judgment of the High Court, but that was principally on the ground that the award was totally unintelligible and you could not find out the reasons for the award. Then we'll come to limitation. Now I think it's very well settled law that after the award is delivered to the party and not to the council, the limitation is 3 months, not 90 days, it is 3 months, and it can be extended by a further period of 30 days and no more. Only exceptions under Section 14 of the Limitation Act may be available, but Section 5, 17, etc. of the Limitation Act will not. Now, I'd just like to deal with a little bit on Section 37 before I conclude. Now, 37 talks about orders appealable to the court. Now, there are two types of orders which have been contemplated. One, orders passed by the arbitral tribunal itself, and one, orders passed by the court. So I'll deal with first the orders passed by the court. The first is an order passed by a court refusing to refer parties to arbitration. Obviously, this envisages an application being filed in judicial proceeding like a civil suit, that this matter is bound to be referred to arbitration because of an arbitration clause in the agreement. Now, if the court appoints an arbitrator and refers the parties to arbitration under Section 8, then no appeal lies. But if it refuses to refer the matter to arbitration, then an appeal lies to the court. The court concerned, obviously, because that I'm not getting into this, the time is too short today, what is the court, but to the court concerned. And then the court can decide whether the interpretation given by is right or wrong. With regard to the scope, I will just talk about this later. Then granting or refusing to grant any measure under Section 9. Section 9 of the Act empowers the court to grant interim relief. And here also, if interim relief is granted or not granted, the aggrieved party can come and challenge that order in court. It's sometimes called an interim award, but I would rather call it an order rather than an interim award. Then setting aside or refusing to set aside an arbitral award under Section 34. Then comes an appeal also lies to court from an order of the arbitral tribunal, accepting the plea referred to in subsection 2 or subsection 3 of Section 16, which relates to the competence of the arbitral tribunal. A party must raise the objection with regard to the competence of the arbitral tribunal at the first stage. And if it is raised at the first stage and the arbitral tribunal decides one way or the other, either that it is competent or not competent to hear the matter, then an appeal lies to the court. And 2B, granting or refusing to grant an interim measure under Section 17. This is similar to 9 by the courts and 17 to the Now, as far as 34 is concerned, there can be no manner of doubt that the scope of jurisdiction of the scope of powers of the appellate court under section 37 cannot be wider than those of the court dealing with an application under section 34. In fact, there's a recent judgment of Justice Shanta Gowda in MMTC versus Vedanta, wherein he's held that the scope is the same. This would also flow out from the other judgment, which says that even the limitation for filing an appeal under section 37 will be the same as that provided under section 34. So that is not a problem. But what about the other provisions? In my view, the scope would be slightly larger. It is an appeal. It is not an application. It is an appeal which lies to the court, refusing to the parties to refer to under section 8. So the court can have a different view from the arbitrator and say, you don't have jurisdiction. Here it will read here the scope, it has a right to differ with even a view with the arbitrator, and if two views are possible, it may or may not agree with the arbitrator. Then, even with regard to interim measures, since it's an appellate court, the jurisdiction would be slightly wider. It would be wider, but not so wide as in a regular appeal, but wide enough as in a civil suit where an appeal lies against an interim direction under Order 39 and an appeal lies under Order 43 of the CPC to a higher court. It's something more than a revisional power. It's something more than a supervisory power, but maybe less than full appeal. So, but I would feel that the little scope is wider. I think I've spent about 45 minutes or maybe more, and I'd like to wind up. But by winding up, I'd like to just say again a few words that in the last 5 or 6 years, the quality of arbitrators has risen. I also strongly feel that arbitration must become institutionalized. The more we have institutionalized arbitrations and arbitrators appointed through institutions, that the respect for arbitrators will increase even amongst the judiciary. Why do judges interfere? Because sometimes they feel something has gone so wrong that, well, somehow I'll set aside this award. The other aspect which the judges must change their thinking is that they must correct every error. We must realize that when parties agree for arbitration, they agree that the arbitrators will be the final word as far as facts are concerned. The arbitrators will not, will decide the matter as they perceive and not as judges perceive. You see, it's like in a criminal case in the jury system. We don't have a jury system in this country. The last case was in 16-1. The Nanavati trial was the last jury case. But like in a jury trial, in cases where they have jury trials, the findings of fact given by the jury cannot be interfered even by the trial judge. He can only give directions as to what evidence is admissible and what evidence is not admissible. But the finding arrived on a fact by a jury is very, very rarely, I mean, almost, it would be 1 in a million cases where it is changed. Now, this sort of approach has to be developed that we can't correct every error. And that approach not only has to apply to arbitration, but I feel it has to apply across the board. I personally feel that the Supreme Court is flooded with cases which it has no business of looking at, because some of us feel that the High Court has made a mistake, we must correct it. We don't realize that we also make mistakes in the Supreme Court. At least when I was in the Supreme Court, I must have made many mistakes. And if you'd set up a court higher than the Supreme Court, judgments would be set aside. The UK has seen it. Their House of Lords was changed to the Supreme Court of England, and in human rights matters, the cases go to the European Court of Human Rights, and so many of the judgments are changed. If there was a world court, their judgments would also be changed. So when we we must develop an ethos of respecting arbitrators, respecting awards, and feeling that we are not there to correct every error. And it is only patent illegality or the other grounds which are strictly covered, which can be corrected. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you. We just couldn't have a better sum up of the entire difference between section 34 and 37. And that too in a capsule form. During the lockdown, we were all having different capsules so that we could improve our immunity. But this capsule of the entire gamut of section 34 and 37 has been well received. I can see that people are also sharing it on the Facebook. I will take the few questions which have been posted meanwhile. Srinivas M. Arbitration between government organizations are one-sided, and arbitration between government organizations on one side and private parties on the other side. It invariably happens that organizations mostly lose such cases. Can we say that the ADR mechanism should not be implemented for the government organization, as it is primarily tilted towards the private parties?
I don't think that is all correct. You see, there are 2-3 reasons why many cases are decided against government bodies. One, in government bodies, the primary reason is that in government bodies, nobody wants to take a decision. If even if a senior official feels that something is due to a party, but he's scared that if he orders on the file that this amount be paid to the party, some charges may be leveled against him. So he says he rather takes the easier way out. That is one. And sometimes, so many times, genuine claims are rejected because you tend to because these and therefore in arbitration these people, what is happening?
So it's a screen sharing of the event only, nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you sort of tend to, that is one reason. Section 80 of the CPC provides that to give notice of 60 days before filing a suit to a government body. What was the intention of that? That in those 60 days, the government should look into the matter, decide if the claim is payable to pay it. In my experience of more than 4 decades, I've never seen a single Section 80 CPC notice being replied to by the government. Leave aside being agreed to or something. So that is one. Secondly, sometimes government bodies don't conduct the cases as well as private bodies. That is also the reason. And well, I'll not discount totally the third factor, but that is not so much. I think mainly it is because I don't agree with the question that government cases should not go to arbitration. And then there are some states like I know of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, which have set up arbitral tribunals only to decide their matters, and they are also doing a good job. So those are arbitral tribunals to decide all cases between the government and private parties, and these are retired high court judges or somebody managing these arbitral tribunals and doing a fairly good job, I would say.
So Anurag Jain, can we move an application for additional evidence at the time of filing objections under Section 34?
I don't think so. I would not at all encourage a practice of filing an application for additional evidence in Section 34, because 34 very clearly says it's on the basis of the record before the trial.
Rajendra Prasad, the defendant admitted the claim of the plaintiff in writing but fails to implement. The plaintiff filed a suit. Still, it has to be referred to an arbitration as per the agreement or not?
No. He has admitted the claim.
Yes. Once he says in the suit he has admitted the claim, do we still refer it to the arbitration or not?
I haven't thought about that, but I don't think so. It needs to be referred to arbitration, because under 12(6) then a decree could be passed under Order 12 Rule 6 on the basis of the admitted pleading between the parties. Because why send them to another round of litigation just to decide? You see, he says I owe 5,000, I owe 5,000. Now why send him to the arbitrator to pay another 5,000 to the arbitrator? I don't think so. That would be, sometimes you have to take a more realistic approach.
So Dipali Puri, she's a lawyer from Chandigarh. You already know her. What is your opinion on the judgment curtailing the limitation period in respect of Section 37 by importing that of Section 34? Was it the intention of the legislature according to you or not?
I'm not sure whether it was the intention of the legislature. Let me be very clear. I've gone through the judgment also. And but I think the court has given fairly valid reasons. I have the judgment before me. And the court has given fairly valid reasons that the limitation in 37 should be similar to 34. You may be right that, strictly speaking, I'm not sure whether, because there is a gray area there, because when limitation is not prescribed under the Act, then the Limitation Act would normally apply. But I think it would have led to this great delay in arbitration. There's a great delay in the, so the court brought down this limitation to 120 days. I won't, sir. See, mainly it's right that the appellate proceeding is the continuation of the appeal. But in many cases, the limitation prescribed for a initial period, initial suit or something may be totally different from an appeal. Limitation provided for an appeal and an appeal limitation provided for a second appeal or not is different. So, I mean, I tend to agree that maybe the court has gone a little beyond what was the intention of the legislature. But in the larger interest, I think it may be right. But I don't know what about past cases. I have my little doubts about this.
Dr. Meeta Agarwal, she is a professor in theory in the law department itself. What is wrong with section 89 of CPC? Court shall formulate the terms of settlement and give them to the parties for their observation. And after receiving the observation, the court may reformulate the terms of possible settlement and refer. Whether the very purpose of ADR and speedy trial will not be affected in this process?
I am not really, let me be honest, I have not got into this aspect today because I was only concentrating on 34 and 37. I not venture into what 89 says. I'm not really. I'm sorry, madam, but I will not be able to answer this question.
Lokesh Kumar, can courts take suo motu cognizance to set aside the arbitral award?
I don't think so. No, that's the clear answer to that.
That's perfect. Do you believe that other than retired judges / senior advocates, lawyers should also be given an opportunity to preside as an arbiter in arbitral proceedings?
Definitely. I was never designated as a senior advocate, and I did conduct a number of arbitration proceedings. I mean, there's nothing wrong. And you see, you have to, I would even give arbitrations. You see, we have arbitrations and arbitrations. There could be disputes which are of small amounts, which are simple disputes, which can be handed over to young lawyers also. You see, we have to have a trained bar at the arbitration. See, there are people who actually concentrate on arbitration. Except that the Act provides that the lawyer must have 10 years experience. So that being the minimum qualification required. Otherwise, I don't feel, I really feel that lawyers can be made up. Presiding arbitrator.
So in our High Court, that is in Punjab and in our High Court, we do have a panel of the lawyers also. It constitutes of retired judges and other people also.
When I was practicing, did a few arbitration both as a lawyer and as well as a arbitrator. But it depends. You see, the court must have faith in the lawyer. Because arbitrators being the final word on facts and the final word in law also in many aspects. When the court appoints an arbitrator and exercises powers under 11(6), the court has to be very, very sure that it can trust the person who's being appointed. So that's why 10 years experience, and it's not that anybody can be appointed. You know, normally you look at the dispute and feel that that's.
Deepak Mishra, appointment of an arbitrator by one party making other party to accept the appointment, would it harm the arbitration proceedings?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Appointment of an arbitrator by one party making other party to accept the appointment would harm the arbitration proceedings. Probably he would have to go to that Parkinson's judgment.
No, I've really not understood what
Sir, he says appointment of, probably his wording, I could reframe it. He says, can one party appoint an arbitrator and the other party has to accept the appointment of that arbitration proceeding?
No, it can't do that. It can't be. It has to be either by consent of the parties. If supposing an agreement says one arbitrator, and then the other party must accept it. Though if the arbitration agreement says that if you must raise your objection within 30 days or 45 days, otherwise the arbitrator appointed shall be deemed to be. I mean, that's otherwise both parties must agree to, and if they don't agree to, then they will have to go to court under Section 11 to have the arbitrator. You can't force an arbitrator on something.
He says both the parties in dispute are at Chennai. The cause of action also arose in Chennai. The arbitrator is also Chennai. Yet, can the proceedings be held in Mumbai?
Yes, the venue can be Mumbai, but the seat cannot continue to. But why would in such a case it would not happen? Why would anybody want to go to Mumbai? But the seat of the venue and seat, there is a lot of difference. And today's I didn't touch on that too much because it was 34 and 37. But you can have a seat somewhere else and the venue somewhere else. But that also with the agreement of the parties. The arbitrators can't decide that, okay, I'm going to go to Switzerland in the summers, so we'll have the venue in Switzerland. The parties will have to agree to
whatever. Few lawyers have started, Mukesh Sandhu, few lawyers have started chambers where they try to resolve the disputes in parties and save them from litigation. That means they conduct arbitration without court orders. What is the legality of such chambers?
No, I'm sorry, these are not arbitrations, but they're pre-litigation dispute settlements. And I'm very happy if young lawyers are doing that. I as a young lawyer, had started this practice of getting even, tenancy. When you're a young lawyer, you get eviction petitions and all, either from the landlord or from the tenant. I would try and get those matters settled rather than, linger them on for 10, 20 years, make payment to the tenant to wait or take, that sort of thing. And if you can get these matters settled, I'm telling you, it gives you much more satisfaction than just dragging on cases in court. I really admire these young lawyers who have started this pre-litigation dispute redressal, and they should be able to charge their full fees for that. You see, we have this feeling in mind. You haven't, ab 10 din court nahi gaye, so you can't take money. Why? If you can get it settled outside the court, save the party the money of filing appeals, coming up to the Supreme Court. Why can't these lawyers charge a fairly decent amount as fees to say, we've helped to settle the matter, and it can be done. I'll just give an example, though that relates to mediation. And this was at a time when mediators were not expected to charge any fees. I appointed a lawyer in Simla as a mediator in a dispute between two villages. And the dispute was resolved. And both the parties came and said that we want to pay the mediator. You settle the fees. I said, at that time, the mediation policy was that nothing is to be paid. I said, I'm not going to settle anything. You please, if you have to pay something, you pay the mediator directly. The mediator told me later that he'd been paid an amount which was much beyond what he would have demanded also. Because the two villages, it was a dispute between two villages, they felt that they'd been litigating for 30 years, they would have litigated for another 30 years. So they paid him something very decent. So this is what I don't think parties will hesitate to pay if their disputes are finally resolved.
So I would rather.
But it's not arbitration. I want to make
it is more like a pre-litigation stage and a mediation and conciliation. Large number of lawyers especially in the South and Mumbai, they are doing mediation also, and rather they are also giving online training, etc. And we will be holding one of the webinars on that issue as to how that lawyers can be. So Himanshu Kanda, should cases in India be categorized for arbitration so that the workload of courts be reduced?
There are two sides to this. There are certain cases which can be listed for arbitration. But finally, arbitration also has to be with the consent of the parties. I don't think it can be forced. You can't force arbitration on parties because they have a constitutional right to go to the courts. You can't take away that is the constitutional right. And that, if it has to be taken away, they must be satisfied with the alternate dispute redressal mechanism. And therefore, I don't know, you can categorize criminal cases, no, you can't bring in criminal and matrimonial cases, but you may bring in cases of commercial nature, etc., which may be decided. But I don't think we can force people into arbitration. And we've not reached that stage yet when the arbitration bar or the arbitration decision-making system has developed to such an extent. And that can only happen when there's complete institutionalization of arbitration.
So like it is always said, I've received a message also on the earlier occasion also we had received once we had done a webinar on arbitration. Like they all say that the finality of the arbitration award should be achieved. But one factor which could also weigh is that once the arbitral tribunal knows the fact that there will be not much interference. And let's assume there is something more like what your good self had said, that there is something amiss in the award, or let's assume there is something more than what the eye could see. And then in that eventuality, just like as we do in section in the RSA, my personal take is that there should be interference. If we say that there shouldn't be any interference and it becomes the entire award has to be attained finality, then the scope of the awards being favored or having bias, etc., could just creep in. What is your take on that, sir?
See, again, first of all, that when the parties agree, there are two things. Again, when the parties agree to appoint an arbitrator, they must do so. And when the lawyers draft these agreements for arbitration clauses, they must ensure that the clause is drafted in such a fashion that the arbitrator appointed is somebody who can be trusted. Secondly, courts, while appointing arbitrators, should also ensure under 11(6) that people who have a good reputation are appointed as arbitrators. But finally, you have to trust somebody or not. You see, you have to trust somebody. And as I said when I was speaking, there are ways and means of writing a judgment. You write it in such a fashion that it falls within the purview of a perverse illegality. Because sometimes you do something very, very wrong and your conscience does not allow you to uphold it. It's happened to me in a couple of cases. But then you try and work it around, see, you have to work harder in these cases to see how you bring it within those within the ambit of section 34 to be satisfied.
Point well taken, that the conscience of the judge as well as the judicial conscience has to be invoked while we do that.
Yeah, this happens in very rare cases, but it must be.
So, Prabodh says they were on the Facebook post, can a court entertain an appeal under section 34 if a percentage of the arbitral award specified under law is not deposited in terms of MSME Act?
No, I was sorry. Again, can you repeat the question?
His question is rather of two folds. He says, can a court...
There was some audio disturbance. So
can a court entertain an appeal under section 34 if the percentage of the arbitral award specified under the law is not deposited? Say MSME Act.
MSME Act. There's some judgment on that MSME Act. I've not really gone into that judgment today. Under the MSME Act, there's a judgment recently of the Supreme Court also. I'm not sure. I'll leave it, Vishal, because I've not really.
No, I will just check it out because
there is a judgment. No, there's a recent judgment. I just saw it a few days back on MSME.
I will take another question. Meanwhile, I will just check it out. Can legislation not make arbitrators award as final and no recourse? He says whether it should be finalized by the under the garb of the legislation itself.
I would not at all agree to this suggestion, because your question one previous to the previous question raised various issues where sometimes awards are to be set aside, and section 34 is there only because of that awards can be set aside. And you know, if you had no judicial review of arbitrators award, then the courts would find another means of invoking Articles 226 and 227 of the Constitution of India to set aside awards, which may be more dangerous than limiting the powers under Section. As it is, there is a judgment of Justice Nariman, I think, that 227 powers against 34 decisions are not totally taken up, though they must be used in very limited circumstances. Any other question?
And he says once, if the would the arbitrator be liable to refund the fees?
I don't think so. He's done his job. I mean, if it is set aside on the ground, I mean, if I was sitting in the 34 and I set aside an award on a ground of something like the bias of the arbitrator or something which he's made a false declaration under 12 and not told the parties, I might direct him to refund the fees. But normally not. If he's done his job, we all make errors. We all make mistakes. You can't ask the refund of fees. I mean, is a lawyer asked to refund his fees if he loses the case? I mean, you can't do that.
In that eventuality, the principle of good faith should come in. So one last question from
Pavan. Pavan is there. I see Pavan Mutneja also there. Yeah.
So I can unmute him. Mr. Mutneja. So meanwhile, sir, we had been hearing you on that virtual platform till we unmute Mr. Pavan Mutneja. You had said that a lot of reading, the books, etc., helped you a lot to improve your flair for everything. Like you said that whenever you used to go on the mall, you used to take some books and literary books. What is your take? Because large number of participants didn't attend your virtual farewell party.
See, what I said was in thanks to my dad, that I lost him when I was just 12 and a half, 13 years old. That he had inculcated the habit of reading in me. Every Saturday, St. Edward's School, where I used to study, used to wind up at 11:30. We'd meet him on the mall. And then he'd take us to a bookshop, buy some books. And he encouraged me. And I became a voracious reader. And that reading helped me get knowledge. And I read everything. From John Grisham, turning fast pages along, to anything which is slow paced, philosophy, everything. And what I said on my farewell, I will say it again, that a lawyer or a judge, anybody in the legal fraternity, needs to be a master, needs to be a jack of all trades. He needs to have knowledge of all aspects. You will get to do cases. I remember one of the first cases which I, as a junior lawyer, filed was a petition by a young boy trying to get into the MBBS college, and we challenged what was the answer key. Now this was in 81, and at that time there had been no case in the country where an answer key had been permitted to be challenged. We had a very receptive judge in Justice V.D. Misra, and that answer key was finally set aside. And to the credit of the professors who were called to defend, they said very honestly that the answer key is given by them is wrong. But when I filed it, I had also to go through all those science, and science was not one of my favorite subjects, but I had to go through to be sort of convinced that what this young boy was telling is correct. So you need knowledge if you are doing, say, arbitration cases of construction. You'll have to have some knowledge, basic knowledge of mathematics, how to, and then construction. So we need to have politics, we need to know politics, we need to know political science, we need to know history, we need to know geography. And therefore reading and literature is a part of law. I think Justice Sikri has recently, in Live Law also I saw it, there's a write-up by him on literature and the law. They have a close connection with each other. I think as one famous lawyer said about his huge law library, that these are the tools of my trade. And his real library were the other books which were lying outside his chamber or in his bedroom and in the drawing room. That this is my real library. And these which are in books in the chamber are my tools of trade. That's my view also.
In fact, on bar and bench, the senior advocate, Mr. K.V. Vishwanathan, has also on his write-up, as well as when he was live, he has also said that the books should be done not only of literature, music, etc. Whatever you do, it does imbibe within you, and then you grow much better as a lawyer, and you cultivate the habits also.
See, I also feel, especially since there are a lot of young lawyers and students in your audience, that you must have some hobbies, some interests outside the law also. Those who stay only within the domain of law, they may do very well in the beginning, but when they're going to expand into the field of constitutional law or going into development of law, you see, if you are going to strictly follow the rule of law or the strict letter of the law, then you don't need this literature. But if you want to expand the field of law, you want to be, say, what is the meaning going to be given to Article 21 of the Constitution? What is the meaning to liberty being given? What is the meaning to equality being given? What is in the context of arbitration? What is fundamental policy of India? These you will not find in the law books initially. When you develop what is that, you will have to develop it from literature, from theory, from legal theory, and legal political theory also.
So, Mr. Amavek, in a case where arbitration clause was vague and provided two options to the party to resort any of the modes of the arbitration, say ICC or unilateral, and once an arbitration proceedings unilaterally through ICC, the other party approached under section 11 subclause 6 for appointment of an arbitrator under the unilateral. The court, however, declined the petition on the ground that the arbitration proceedings had already commenced and relegated the party to the ICC tribunal. His question is, in such a situation, should the court not assume more proactive role to give construction to such an arbitration clause rather than relegating the parties to the tribunal so as to take objection under section 34?
I don't think so. You see, ICC can be very expensive, and so it might sometimes be seen as almost unaffordable by some. But then that is when you drop your arbitration clause, you have to be very careful. If you left an error in the drafting and you've left it either of the two, and the other party has chosen one of the two, I don't think there was anything wrong in the court saying that 11.6 we can't now appoint a fresh arbiter.
So before we take any other question, we have unmuted Mr. Mutneja. Though it is very difficult to mute him, he is a very jolly person. To Mr. Mutneja. And it is always a pleasure to hear him inside and outside the court.
Yeah, I practiced with him for the last, in Himachal High Court, we did a large number of cases together.
Mr. Mutneja.
I'll also ask a question on expansion of the judicial process, specifically with regard to Section 34. There are the arbitration agreements in which state is one side and small industrial units the other side. The state keeps with itself the power to appoint an arbitrator. Arbitrator appointed by the state, invariably they give judgments totally favoring the state without taking into account even the genuine defenses of the industries or the other side. And when they go before the courts under Section 34, then they are accosted that our jurisdiction is very limited. So the first stage where they really can approach is the High Court. Now, should the ambit of Section 34 not be enhanced to such an extent to go into the aspects of facts, the differences in facts, and should the district courts not go into this aspect of factual this thing, incongruent with?
Pavan, I won't agree with you because I think if we expand the scope of Section 34, in fact, I personally feel that the courts have already expanded it more than it should have been expanded. I know there is a problem when one party is in a position of, because when you go to take a loan from somebody or get some scheme under a scheme, you just sign on the dotted line without reading the arbitration clause also. But even now, because of the amendments in the new Act, that arbitrator is supposed to be an independent person. He cannot be linked directly or indirectly with the party. So if you can succeed, if you can show that the arbitrator has been appointed in violation. So that is an amazing. But I personally am not in agreement with this, merely because in some cases, injustice may be done. I agree with you that some cases that the scope of Section 34 should be. I'm not in.
Thank you.
So Vishal, should we wind up?
Yes, sir. So before we wind up, according to you, since it's a normal question that we had also told you the format of this thing. So like one, you told that the lawyers should read a lot beyond that. And that is one of the reasons that we had taken we decided to name our team as Beyond Law, because we thought that we should always think beyond the law. Not only on this platform, we have been calling the people. We have also called TED Talk speakers and other persons, so that we can learn and imbibe different knowledges, because we have found that eventually simplicity of knowing knowledge of law would be narrowing down your compass of thought process. One, we have we have also taken from you. And as we said that Justice Sikri and Senior Advocate K.V. Vishwanathan also believed in that. And we had taken that cue from your Fable Party, etc. Now, what other things are, according to you, are good tools which one should have in the lawyers, in himself, as well as in the library, so that he can improve from an ordinary lawyer to an extraordinary lawyer? What should be that extra input which, according to you, should be there?
There are a few inputs. I mean, I'll wind up with this. There are a few inputs which I feel. First of all, you must have sensitivity to your client. You see, all of us don't practice in the High Court. I mean, your audience may be those who practice in the High Courts or Supreme Court, but they're trial court. We must be sensitive to the problems which a litigant comes to us. And I was very happy to note that when you said that some of you were trying to get the disputes resolved outside the court. You need to be a good human being to become a good lawyer. You may be a successful lawyer is something else, and a good lawyer is something. To be a good lawyer, in my view, you need to be a good human being also, sensitive to the needs of the client. Then obviously, hard work always pays. Being abreast with the law. Even if you can't afford to have an actual library as you can have a virtual e-library anytime. And today, if even if you are abreast with social media and sites like Live Law, Bar and Bench, and so many others, you could still be abreast with the law without having. You have to be abreast with the law. Then another important thing is for lawyers who are practicing is to sit in the courtroom. If you sit in the courtroom, you understand how successful lawyers carry out their cases and how judges react to certain situations. We judges are also human beings. Every judge reacts differently to different situations. So you also have to analyze which judge reacts how to what situation. And when you go before that judge, you argue the matter in that fashion, which point to be taken up first. And therefore, it is very important to be sitting in the courtrooms, watching how your judges react to which situations. It's a very, very important thing. It's one of the most important tools. When I was a lawyer, in every judge's court, we used to sit I would sit 2-3 days in the beginning to see what his reaction is. Whether in cases of, say, laborers, how does he react? Whether in tax cases, how he reacts. And then you go with your cases, you have to appear before all sorts of judges, so you deal with that. You also learn how good counsel deal with awkward situations. See, the bar room is a very interesting place. When I became a judge, after 2 months, my Chief Justice asked me, what do you miss? I said, I miss the bar room. But in the beginning years of your profession, don't spend too much time in the bar room because it is such an interesting place that you'll not go to the courtroom. And if you don't go to the courtroom, you'll not know how to handle the court. Because a lawyer must not only know the law, he must know the judge. And I don't mean it in the sense of knowing the judge personally. but he must know the judge as to what is in the mind of the judge. For me, it has always been very important to note what is in the back of the mind of the judge. And Pavan and I know we lost a case which we should have won, because the judges had a mind which we could not set aside in that particular case. On evidence, we should have won that case, but on morality and all, we knew we were on a losing. So it is, sometimes we tried our best, but we couldn't turn around the mind of the judges. So there is where the real knack between being a very successful lawyer and an ordinary lawyer lies, is that hard work, that concentration of knowing what to present. You have 8 good points, but one point will appeal to one judge and another to another judge. So try to find out what will appeal to them.
It's a point well taken. They say that you have, for an outstanding lawyer, you have to be inside the courtroom rather than standing outside the court.
Yeah,
and as earlier said, sir, the entire scope of section 34, 37 plus your takes that how a lawyer should become from that ordinary lawyer to an extraordinary lawyer. I suppose, at least I know that I've learned a lot during this 1.5 hour session, which in the ordinary course, when it would not have been a lockdown, it would not have been possible. It's all because of your takes and all. And as you had rightly observed and informed us, that one should go to this thing. We had one of the webinars on Law Kitchen, and some people asked that why you have named this as a Law Kitchen. We said that for a lawyer, you have to require 2 things. One is the drafting, and drafting is your kitchen. And the another part is the art of presentation, that is within the courtroom. So once you have to be a good chef to make a good presentation, and that is taken well by the courts. And that session was done by the senior advocate from Punjab Haryana High Court, Puneet Bali. So, and thank you, it was a wonderful session. Since Mr. Mutneja is here, and it ultimately turned out you have a very relationship running down large number of years back, I would ask Mr. Mutneja to propose a formal vote of thanks on behalf of Beyond Law CLC, as well as ULS Chandigarh. Over to you, Mr. Mutneja.
No, before Pavan speaks, I must congratulate him for his daughter's wedding. We haven't had he told me, but there's a formal, so congratulations to you and Madhu.
So another factor, his daughter has just passed out from, she has also done law in US, another facet. So we were all sharing with Mr. Mutneja that during this lockdown time, all good news is pouring in your family.
No, it's the second aspect is my daughter's cleared the California bar exam, which is supposed to be the toughest bar exam in the US. New York bar exam is only at number 13 and number 1 is California. So she cleared that. That was a good news. But we must.
Before Mr. Mutneja says vote of thanks, then we can say like father, like daughter.
We really have to thank you for this 1.5 hours session of real insight into section 34 and 37. Besides that, the question and answer session expanded the scope considerably to tell us the doubts which were in the minds of the judges. Thank you very much for a wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Stay connected. Tomorrow we will be having a webinar at 6 o'clock, and we will be having on the principles of because we have been having webinars. So the topic for tomorrow would be by Justice Sridhar Naidu from Mumbai. So stay connected to us at 6 p.m. Tomorrow we will be sharing the invite meeting ID as this thing. Kindly download the Zoom app, those who have not done.